If you're looking for a PC case which offers a great view into your build and some very nice eye-pleasing aesthetics, then maybe the 4500X from Corsair is the one to look at. Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn here with a review of this case, in which I've crafted in it multiple times so I can show you what it's like in terms of thermal performance, all the things you need to know about building in it in this way, whether you're using just the pre-installed fans and an additional 360mm all-in-one cooler on the top, or whether you want to go a bit more all-in and install fans throughout the case, as I've done here, and also the difference between side mounting and top mounting a radiator. I'll show you the thermal performance of that a little later in this video as well, but I also want to talk to you about the highlights and lowlights of the case, the frustrations and the good bits, so stick with me as we go into all of that. In a separate video, I'll also be comparing it with the Corsair Frame 4000D, which does a better job in terms of cooling performance, even with a minimal build, but obviously doesn't offer the same aesthetics as the 4500X. That said, don't think the 4500X isn't good, because it still does a good job, as you'll see later on in the video, even with a minimalist build like this. So make sure you're subscribed if you want to see the difference between the two, as well as a review of the Frame 4000D and build guides on both of these cases. But let me tell you, it's been a joy to play with this case. It looks really nice, even with the basic build here. As you can see, I've just got 3 intake fans and 3 exhaust fans, and I'll leave the full specs of the build down in the description below. But gaming at 4K, I found I was getting some really good temperatures in this setup, and then using a side-mounted radiator with intake fans on that and on the bottom of the case, I'll show you how that improved performance as well, and talk about what difference that makes and how it's worth considering. But first, before we get into that, I want to break down the case and show you some of the highlights. As you'll see, it comes well packaged, held in place with tape in various different places, including on the fans, but also on that glass panel, which, as you can see, removes interestingly because it pulls out towards the front and then lifts up. There's actually instructions emblazoned on that panel to let you know how to do it, because it is a little bit fiddly to do, and it's obviously different from traditional cases as well. You'll see at the back that you have to kind of put your hand along the edge of the glass here in order to be able to tease it out to then pull it out. It's a little bit difficult to do, but once you get the hang of it, it's fairly straightforward, and it is secured nicely in there, so there's not much danger of it coming off. However, when I went to peel the plastic off, I did find that this motion then pulled the glass out of it, and as you can see, it just slips forward. So it's worth keeping in mind that as you go through the build and you're taking things apart. But you'll also see the instructions for this on the front, which also can be removed as well. Now, there's some other interesting things that I discovered about this in terms of how you have to take it apart and how you have to put it back together again. You'll see that the rear panel on the right hand side just comes off. The vented left hand side is a bit more tricky though, because you have to pull it away towards you from the bottom and then lift it up to unhook from the top of the case. Now, it's worth noting this has a dust filter on it, a thin panel of dust filtering on there. That's stuck to the case, which I hate because it's going to be difficult to clean over time. It's not a very good look, frankly. And as you can see from a different angle, this is how that comes off. So you can see it hooks onto the top. This is an important point of note because the top of the case has to be in place before you can put those panels back on. So watch out for that. Now, the top panel is interesting because it doesn't have any dust filtering on it. This is held in place with thumb screws, and there's no dust filter whatsoever here. So just bear that in mind. Depending on how you built on it, you might find dust ingress that way, perhaps. But you will see that needs to go back on before you can then put the other panels back on. At this point, you're going to see my cable shame, and the cable shame and cable management is an important part of this video that I want to get into. But as you can see, you can still close the door on it and hide that away. And there is enough space there just about, but you do need to make sure the top's on so that it will secure nicely back in place there. The case is available in 2 variants, either with these reverse blade RS120 fans or with iCue Link's LXR fans. So those are both reverse blade options. So you've got reverse blade mounted on the side there. As you'll see, the cabling is visible through the back, but there are some other highlights here, one of which is an anti-sag bracket, which you can see is mounted here ready for your GPU. Now, this is a little bit fiddly, and I did find that it does interfere with the GPU that I was using, but it is handy to have as a nice extra that's already pre-installed for you. Basically, you insert your graphics card into the slot as normal. You unscrew the anti-sag bracket, you then push it up into position, and it then pushes up on the end of the graphics card and holds it in place there. You just have to take care with this that it's not pushing against the fan, and there's a little rubber mount to help with that, but it's not perfect system yet. Still a good move from Corsair to have that though. Now with the case broken down, I want to show you the other bits, because obviously this case supports both standard motherboards and rear connect motherboards, hence all the cutouts around there. And I wanted to install both to show you the difference. So this is a standard ATX motherboard installed on there, and you can see how the wiring might be plugged in there and what that looks like, and get a view of that. As you can see, reasonably easy to get the cables through, but not so easy to make them tidy, compared with a rear connect motherboard where all your cable shame's hidden at the back, and instead you've got a much neater frontage. It does make for a messy build at the back though, which is worth bearing in mind because it requires quite a lot of cable management. This case is relatively easy to build in though, because those fans, for example, are already wired in at the back, and I'll show you that in a second. And then as you'll see, all the front panel cables are underneath these Velcro ties at the rear. There are a number of points to use plastic cable ties as well, but not nearly enough channeling in my mind, especially if you're using a rear connect motherboard. So let's get into some of that, and I'll explain why it was so messy and the thoughts around it. As you can see, all the cables are bundled up nicely like this, but what you will see most importantly is that the three fans are already chained together for you, and then you've got the male and female connectors at the top for 5V RGB and for fan power, and then at the bottom you've got the female end of that. Now the female end will plug into your motherboard, so 5V RGB header, chassis fan header or system fan header, plug that in on your motherboard, then all three fans are sorted. At the other end, these connectors can be used to connect them up to additional fans in the system. So very straightforward in terms of the wiring, and it's nice that it's already set up for you. Obviously the iCue Link version will be different, but in this instance I'm using a Norseless 360mm RS with RS120 fans on it as well. So what I did there is I linked those fans together, and then I installed the radiator at the top. Now the idea here is this is quite useful because you can connect the fans and the pump to the motherboard with their own CPU fan header and the AIO pump header, for example. But then what I can do is I can take the male end of the RGB connector from the three fans already on the case and connect it to the female cable on the three fans on the radiator and the pump, and that way all the RGB lighting is connected to a single header on the motherboard, and then when you turn it on you can see it all lights up nicely like that. So it's all connected really easily there. Makes wiring that up very straightforward, and then you can use your motherboard software like Gigabyte's RGB Fusion, MSI Mystic Light or whatever else to then control the RGB lighting really easily, or Open RGB or Signal RGB are alternatives. The downside is, as I've shown, cable mess, so there's a lot of cables to deal with at the back here, especially with the rear connect motherboard. Now there are places to run these cables. On the right hand side you'll see we have some Velcro loops through there, which I used for the two 8-pin EPS CPU power connectors. So you can run it through these holes here, tie those down with the little ties at the top there, and sort that out so you can neaten that up on that side. But the main mess is on the left hand side, and there's not enough space here. So you've got some Velcro ties here, and as you can see, most of the cables are already tied down for you, but you can add yours to it and then get to tidying that. But I'll show you in a second that when you use a rear connect motherboard, the problem is the connectors are then pushed through to the back and you have to get them out of the way. So what I found is I had to go to the accessories box, which is very nice by the way, because you can use that to section out all the screws so you know where everything is nice and logically. Keep that nice and tidy. You use the little plastic cable ties from that to then tie the cables down. Now I'm trying to tie some of the fan cables down so they're out of the way of the connectors, because what you'll see is the rear connect connectors are basically where the cables were originally tied down. This is especially the case for the USB-A port and the SATA ports down here, where I had to abandon the Velcro tie that was there before and then I'm using the plastic cable ties instead to try and not only tie the cables down, but get them out of the way of the other ports that I need to plug into. It's just not enough room here, sadly. And this is probably part of the compromise of supporting both standard motherboards and rear connect motherboards. It's an interesting problem, but as you can see by the end of it, there's a lot of cable mess here. And unfortunately, some of it's even visible from the front. So if you look carefully to the left-hand side of the radiator here, you'll see the power cables for the 24-pin connectors actually visible there, which isn't ideal. In the box is also included this strip. This strip is designed to cover over the holes if you're using a rear connector motherboard to hide away some of this, make it look a little bit neater. On the Frame 4000D, that installed like this really easily and worked reasonably well and was pretty straightforward to do. Well, on the 4500X, I found that I couldn't install it because of the anti-sag bracket, which is pre-installed. You have to remove that first in order to put this in, which is daft. But with a little bit more aggressive tidying, I made it so you couldn't really see the cables. Now, if you want to add fans to the bottom, you can do that too. So I've got some additional RS120 fans. You have to use these long screws, which are also included in the accessories box, to mount them to the bottom of the case. Now, obviously, these are above the power supply unit, so they're going to have limited amount of airflow through them in my mind, and also you've got more cables to manage, which is going to be a little bit tricky. Fairly easy to install. You do have to take the GPU out in order to do it, so recommend building them in a logical way. But you can see you can put two there, and then you can put an additional one down here, and I've managed to chain those together so the cabling at the back isn't going to be too difficult. Now, I'll show you later on what difference this made in terms of cooling, but this one at the front is the only one that's got good access to good airflow. That step design for the power supply unit, I think, might have some passive air going through it, but obviously some of it's going to be blocked by the power supply, so I just think it's not going to be that great, and as I'll show you, it doesn't make a massive difference to the GPU temperatures. However, as you can see, it looks a lot nicer with the additional fans in there. And if you're going for the RGB glow, then it's certainly a nice addition to the case. But then there's more cables visible here, and that's the nature of these fans, unfortunately. With iCue Link fans, it would probably be neater. But you can put a 140mm fan at the rear as well, so I did that too. Another limitation of the case is storage. You can only put 2 SSDs or a mixture of SSDs and hard disk drives on this tray, which mounts to the back of the motherboard. That's the only location in the case for mounting this and for putting drivers in. As you can see, the space is fairly limited anyway. Now, this might not be an issue for most people. A lot of people are using NVMe drives now, so maybe it's not even a problem. You're not even going to do it. But obviously doing this means more cables, and it was a bit tricky to get to the SATA ports for this, so even more complexity there. If you've done that and then you're going to be using an RGB controller, whether it's Corsair's or a Thermalright one, for example, then you've got to find space for that as well, which was also a bit of a problem for me because there's now not much room for that. So I ended up just jamming it down here, sticking it to the back of the motherboard there, or the case anyway, and then wiring that in. Even more mess, even more chaos. So something to keep in mind then. Then the door does fortunately go back on over the top of all that shame. Just make sure you nudge the cables over to the right so they're not visible through the front where possible. Now later on I'm going to show you the performance of just these intake fans and then the exhaust radiator and how we tested that. But another thing I wanted to do was to see about fitting an additional fan at the rear. So as you've seen, I put a 140mm fan on there eventually. You can put a 120mm fan there as well. But if you've got the tubes on the left-hand side for the radiator, you just can't. I found that even if I shifted the radiator all the way over to the right, there just still wasn't enough space behind the tubes to install a fan there. Now, if you put the tubes on the right-hand side, you would be able to do this, but obviously, aesthetically wise, you'd then be covering over the fans on the side with the tubes, and that might not look as nice. Alternatively, we can side mount the radiator. I did wonder whether I should do a push-pull setup on this, but that might not be possible depending on the length of your GPU. Also, if you're wondering, putting the tubes at the bottom, as you can see, could also be problematic here. It might be possible. Again, it depends on your graphics card, but it doesn't look amazing here in this setup. However, the back panel is pretty easy to access. You can remove that tray, so you can actually unscrew it. I chose not to, but you could unscrew it and take it off and then mount your radiator to it. So as standard, it's got the 3 intake fans on it, the reverse blade fans, but you can put a radiator on there as an alternative. So what I've done now is I've taken the radiator that I had mounted to the top, put it on the side, and then simply put the reverse blade fans that were already on there onto the radiator instead. You might be theorizing that this is going to reduce the airflow for the graphics card because these are reverse blade fans which are now pulling air through the radiator into the case. But not to worry, because as I'll show you, it's actually still pretty good. I then took the radiator fans and put them on the top, but these are RS120 fans, so they're now exhaust fans. So that's how that's set up. Pretty straightforward. reasonably logical way of doing things. I have found traditionally that doing this means the CPU runs cooler. I'll show you the differences between all that in a little while. First of all, go back to the original build, so the basic one with the top mounted radiator, and I started off by testing with Cinebench, and this is the 2024 version with an AMD Ryzen 9 9950 X3D. I got 2079 as my score in that, which isn't the best score you can get, but you can see the maximum temperature was like 69 degrees C, which is pretty good. Now with a side mounted radiator, my score went up to 2399, so I got a better score, and the temperatures were also good as well. So you can see that we were maxing at 67 degrees here as well. And then with the full system, with all the fans in it, I actually got a worse score, ever so slightly down to 2245. So lower points, slightly hotter temperature as well, which is surprising. Obviously, there's going to be some variance in this, but here are all three of those side by side, so you can pause the video and see the scores for yourself. But what you'll see is the side-mounted intake radiator did result in lower temperatures. So if you look at the core temperatures, for example, you'll see the maximum is lower with that side-mounted intake. Weirdly, with all the fans in the system, it was a little bit hotter, which doesn't make any sense. So there's going to be some variance in there. So what I wanted to do is then test out how we got on with gaming. So now you're going to see a variety of different games here in the three different setups. We're starting off with Wreckfest 2, and I'm playing at 4K on maximum settings on all these games. What I found here is the CPU is getting around 68 degrees C, somewhere around that, so the top end of the 60s, and the GPU is a little bit over 70 degrees. Now in other builds, so in the Frame 4000D for example, I found the GPU was more close to 70, so it was actually lower. So you'll see that when I do the versus comparison. But this isn't terrible. It's not a terrible temperature when you consider currently there's no fans directly blowing from below onto the graphics card. So it's something to keep in mind. We've just got those three intake fans on the side and then three exhaust fans through the radiator in this setup. So then into Ready or Not, again running at maximum settings. This time 66 degrees and a little bit up on the GPU, 67 degrees on the CPU in this setup here. So reasonable temperatures, I think, for this level of gaming. And on this spec, as a reminder, all specs of the builder in the description so you can find out the full build specs, but it's a 5070 and a 9950 X3D for the CPU and GPU setups. And now we're on to Dirt Rally 2. So I've got a variety of games here that I'm enjoying at the moment, so the ones I'm actually playing, and then I wanted to show you how we got on. But you'll see basically the same sort of results across each of these games in this setup. So the GPU's still just over 70, the CPU's in the middle of the 60 degree mark, and the performance has been good, and I wasn't finding that it was running really loud while we're doing this either, and I'll show you a sound test later on so you can hear what that's like without me talking over the top of it. Now some of the finals, again similar sort of thing, and a good smooth experience across here, and just surprising actually when you consider it's a very top-end CPU and, you know, a reasonably mid-range to top-end GPU, and yet it's still not running mega hot in here despite only having those three intake fans. And keep in mind as well that the reverse blade fans won't have as good intake performance as standard fans. So if you had standard fans in there instead of reverse blade, it would put more air through, so it might even be better. But we've got the aesthetics here instead. So now with a side mounted radiator, so this fan logic is still the same. We've got intake through the radiator and exhaust out of the top. What I noticed here is that the CPU temperature has now dropped, so now we're looking much closer to 60 degrees. You can see it's 62 degrees C here, whereas before it was like 65, 66 degrees, so there's quite a bit of difference there, which is interesting. So as expected from other builds, it does meet the CPU cooler if you mount it like this. So Ready or Not, I found the GPU was running a little bit hotter, so maybe a couple of degrees hotter, but again the CPU is significantly cooler. We're looking at 62 degrees here instead of 67, which is an impressive drop. For Dirt Rally 2, the difference is also quite similar. So the GPU is maybe a couple of degrees hotter, but the CPU is significantly cooler at around 60 to 62 degrees versus being 65-ish in the previous build. So in the finals, again, what you're seeing is basically the same across the board. What I noticed is a trend. So yes, there is a tiny increase in the GPU temperature, but quite a significant drop in the CPU temperature. So now we're looking at 74, 75 degrees C on the GPU versus 72 before. but 60-ish to 65 versus 66 and upwards on the CPU. So it's much better performance there. And this is what I found across the board. So it was interesting, I thought. It shows that it's worth doing it in this setup, considering doing a side-mounted radiator if you want to keep your CPU temps down. What happens if you fill the case up with additional fans though? So now I've got more intake fans on the bottom and that exhaust fan at the rear. What I found here is that did help drop the temperatures down a little bit, but not as much as you might think. So now maybe another couple of degrees have been shaved off the GPU as well. So we're looking at about 72 degrees, for example, instead of 74. So we're dropping the temperature of the GPU, but it's not that much. For adding an additional 3 intake fans on there, I basically found across these games that was essentially getting just a couple of degrees cooler on the GPU. And sometimes maybe 4 degrees, but not a massive amount. This is still quite a big leap from the original setup, so putting all those additional fans on and side mounting does make a difference to the GPU temperatures, as you'd expect, because we've now got air blowing directly onto the graphics card, but more importantly, the CPU temperature is also down as well. So it is worth filling the case up. But even as standard, even with the basic setup that I did with the intake fans on the side and then an exhaust radiator, you can get away with really good performance in what is a pretty decent system, I think. So really surprised with how well this is done. Now I will know this isn't as good in terms of airflow as some other cases, where the trade-off for looking really good and still performing really well has been a good balance, I think. So it's not a bad case for a variety of reasons and performs really well in here. And as I said, it doesn't get too loud. Now, obviously, this is just with the RS fans. I can't talk what it's like with the iCue Link fans just yet, but I do plan on visiting that version and talking about that as well. But it'll probably get better performance with that setup. So now I want to leave you with a sound test to show you what it's like with the basic setup that I had in here and how it gets on with just that performance in terms of the sound levels and things. But hopefully you found this video useful. If you have, subscribe to see the full build guide and more on this case. And don't forget to check out the links in the description to buy and find out more about everything in this video. Thanks very much for watching. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.